Welcome to Rights and Remedies, the podcast where law, advocacy, and healing come together. I'm Allison Mahoney, your host and a lawyer dedicated to fighting for the rights of survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, as well as children harmed by the child welfare system. Each week, we delve into legal battles and court cases, share powerful stories that demand change, and spotlight the cutting-edge practices that are helping victims on their journey to healing. So, if you're ready to dive into the intersection of advocacy and healing, subscribe to Rights and Remedies today. New episodes are released weekly, and we can't wait to have you join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference. Welcome back to Rights and Remedies. Before we begin today's episode, please be advised that we'll be discussing domestic violence and sexual assault, which may be triggering for some listeners. So if you need to take a break or just skip this episode, please do so and prioritize your well-being. I'm very excited to have Shannon Meyer, the Executive Director of Response, on today. Response is a nonprofit organization in Colorado that works with survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. Shannon, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Allison.
So before actually, let's start with what does Response do? I know I just gave a very high level overview, but can you provide a little bit more information about the services that Response provides and where in Colorado it works?
Sure, I'll start with our mission. So the mission of Response is to work with our community to end domestic and sexual abuse and to support survivors in achieving their own safety and empowerment. As you said, we do work with survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, as well as stalking and human trafficking. We're on the western slope of Colorado in an area of the Roaring Fork Valley that stretches from the Colorado River up to Aspen. We work with survivors that live in, work in, or even visit our valley. Last year, we worked with 170 survivors in the community, answered close to 300 calls to a 24-hour crisis helpline. And we have an education program as well that had outreach to 750 or so students last year.
That's incredible. And what's your background? What drew you to this type of work?
So interestingly, my background is actually in conservation. I spent my whole career up to coming to Response in environmental conservation and private land conservation. I've lived in the Roaring Fork Valley for 26 years now. And about 7 years ago, the advertisement for the executive director position at Response came across my email through LinkedIn. Probably the only time I opened one of those jobs in your area emails. And I started thinking about this organization that had been around at that point for 34 years. They'd had a founding executive director that had been there for over 25 years. She had left, and then there was a typical churn of trying to find kind of the right replacement for someone who built this organization, made it their life's work. That churn didn't go so well, so they were at hiring their fifth executive director in 7 years. My background at that point in the private land conservation field had really shifted towards nonprofit development and organizational management. I spent a lot of my time working with land trusts around the Southwest on leadership development, board development, fundraising, financial management, kind of the nuts and bolts of running a nonprofit. And that's really where my strength lay. At the same time, I was the mom of a ninth grader at the time. I'm myself a survivor of sexual violence as a child, and it just felt like I was called to take on this role and see what I could do to bring this great organization to the next level.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Shannon, and for that bit about your own experience. And so I'm on the board of directors of Response, and I have seen the transformation over the past several years while Shannon has been the executive director. And we're going to talk about that a bit more and some of the exciting developments that Response has seen, especially over the last year. But before diving into that, I want to break down some of the services that you all offer and talk about that in more detail. So first, for survivors of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, what types of things does Response do for them?
So we have trained advocates that provide individualized advocacy for survivors, either of domestic sexual abuse, stalking, human trafficking, any of those things. And what that really looks like is helping someone figure out their own journey. Survivors of abuse have been in a position where someone has been controlling them. And the last thing that we want to do as advocates is to judge anyone or tell anyone what they should do. So the advocates are really trained in this non-judgmental, trauma-informed approach to working with survivors to help them see what it is that they're experiencing, what their path out might be if they chose to go in that direction. So it's a lot of talking with folks and discussing options. And then once people make a decision to take one of those options, we have a lot of resources that we can help people with. So in addition to that advocacy and crisis intervention, our advocate staff are doing court and medical accompaniment. They're making referrals to other community agencies that could help a client of ours. And then for those that are fleeing abuse, we have a housing program that has 3 levels of assistance. And we can talk more about our new shelter, but essentially we can provide emergency intervention by putting someone up in a hotel that might call us, late at night on a weekend. We might get a referral from law enforcement that they're at a scene of a crime and they need a safe place for a person, and we have that set up. We have a shelter now where we can house survivors for 2 to 3 months while they plan their next steps. And then we have a rapid rehousing program, which is flexible rental assistance for up to a year, so that we can help survivors attain and maintain safe and affordable housing away from their abuser.
Incredible. Truly incredible what response does for the community. You had mentioned just now accompanying survivors to medical exams. And before recording, you and I had a conversation where we talked about SANE exams and that there was a fluctuation this year in particular. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what SANE exams are for people who don't know?
Yeah, so SANE exam, it's a sexual assault nurse exam. So there are nurses that are trained specifically on doing the aftercare and data collection for someone who has been sexually assaulted. They also do forensic exams for people who have gone through a domestic abuse situation and there was a crime of, near strangulation or physical abuse. There is an agency in the Valley called Mountain West SANE Alliance, which brings nurses together who are on call who can conduct those exams in Glenwood at the center down there, the Riverbridge Child Advocacy Center. They have told us, and we have seen the same on our end, that they've seen a somewhat precipitous drop in the calls for SANE exams. And we've talked with our law enforcement partners in the Valley as well. We work with 5 different law enforcement agencies throughout our service area. And they're also seeing a decrease in reporting on sexual violence calls. We know that just with the trends and statistics, that does not mean that there are less sexual assaults happening. It means that there are generally obstacles to reporting, whether those are real obstacles or psychological, societal, cultural obstacles. I think we can all imagine how the changes in administration may have made people frightened of reporting. I would note for people kind of thinking about these things that a SANE exam in Colorado does not mean that you're reporting to police. People have 3 different reporting options. They can have the exam done just for their own safety and well-being. They might need to get preventative medications against sexually transmitted diseases. They may know from the outset that they never want to report at all, and that's completely fine. There's no pressure. The second option is if they're undecided and they want to have DNA and photos taken for potential use if they decide they want to report, and that data can be stored for some future use. Or they may know right away that they want to report, and that data is going to be collected and given to law enforcement to help, with the prosecution.
So I think some people listening might wonder if you go to a SANE exam, are the nurses or the people who are involved in the exam, are they reporting it to law enforcement?
They are not.
Okay.
No.
I think that's an important piece of information for people to have. And I mean, what I like to tell people when I'm representing clients is that it's better to preserve your options because then you have the power to make the choice ultimately. But obviously, there's reasons why people opt to not have a SANE exam. But I do think that it is one way to give yourself more choices down the road.
And I would add to that that of course, if it is a minor,
Mm.
someone under 18, they are mandated reporters, as are the advocates at Response. And also there is both a time sensitivity and a longer window in time than people expect. So if someone suspects a drug facilitated assault, there is a limited window of time in which there can be successful data collection, blood samples that might get that. And it's pretty narrow. I don't know exactly what it is. But at the same time, some people will say, well, it happened a week ago. It's not worth going in because of that specific data point will no longer be collectible. But the program, the sane nurses tell us people can come in after any length of time to share their information, have anything that's left tested, just to have themselves checked out, that there shouldn't be, oh, it's been a week, it's too late to go. They should always reach out and see if there's a way that that exam could support them in their recovery. A lot of times an advocate will be asked to go with a client to a SANE exam, and they can decide at the moment if they just want someone sitting in the waiting room, they want someone in the room with them. Sometimes we'll go to watch minor children while an exam is happening. We do have all of our services offered in Spanish, and that's a way that we can help as well.
That's great. And then in terms of preventative services, when you talk about, well, let me ask about your work with law enforcement. Do you all work with law enforcement and what does that look like?
We're really fortunate in our valley that our law enforcement agencies are very cooperative, very supportive of Response and our work with survivors. So we actually have formal agreements with all of the law enforcement agencies. It's called an advocate initiated referral, so that when police go out on a domestic violence or sexual assault call, they have been trained to refer that victim directly to Response. A lot of other jurisdictions find that they're lucky if a card or brochure will even get passed to a victim in that instance. We have found that the person is experiencing probably the worst night of their life. If you just hand them a card or tell them call this person, that's going to get lost in the overflow of information and emotion that's happening with them. So instead, we will get the victim's name and contact information from law enforcement probably the next day. If it's something where someone is needed on site from Response right away, they'll call us. But usually they'll refer so that we can call the victim the next day on the Monday and offer our services. And we find that about 70% of the time, the victim does accept services to some extent. And I don't know that we run the numbers for last year yet, but some of the 30% that are not accepting services are people who are in our valley on vacation. They're traveling through. It doesn't make sense for them to accept local services, and they may go to wherever they came from and get services there or get a referral from us.
Right.
It's a very successful program, and I know that when I talk to other executive directors, they're pretty jealous that we have that such a great cooperation here.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an important partnership to have. And then what about your work in schools?
So because part of our mission is to basically work ourselves out of business, the best way to do that is to start with our youth, right? So we are in every middle and high school in our service area doing prevention education work. So healthy relationships, sexual consent, it's obviously age appropriate when we're starting with sixth graders and going to 12th graders. We're not teaching the same thing. So we really work with the schools and the teachers to figure out kind of where their kids are, what they're learning in their other classes that we could kind of piggyback on or combine
Mhm.
with. But the primary age that we work with, I would say, like teach the most at is ninth and 10th grade. where we're
Okay.
talking about sexual consent. We've just added a component on sextortion because that's things that the schools have said they're seeing more of, even down to middle school levels. And
Yep.
we really try to be responsive and work with what the needs are. Last year, we did 28 school presentations and reached 750 or so students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, sextortion and tech facilitated abuses, it seems as though those are becoming quite widespread um,
And
among
we've really heard
students.
from the high school principal, they want the kids to be getting this in middle school.
Yeah.
So they're not sharing photos, without understanding what might happen with them, and that that's happening in seventh and eighth, maybe even sixth grade now.
Yep. Yep.
And then also prevention work is community wide, right? It's not just with the kids, but it's getting the word out. I mean, so many people say to me, why do we need a domestic abuse center in the Rainfork Valley? We're Aspen, like that doesn't happen here. I mean, just raising awareness that it does happen here and that it could happen to anyone, regardless of race, socioeconomic, gender, even sexual orientation. Like some people just really aren't aware of that. And when you elevate that conversation, make it more part of the community, it destigmatizes people reaching out for help, whether it's sexual violence and they're feeling like they can't reach out for help because then they have to go to the police and they're worried about their immigration status, or if it's just the shame in a small community of admitting that there's domestic abuse in your relationship. Like all those things are things we need to work together as a community to overcome so that people can get help.
Right. And you've done quite a bit of community engagement over the last couple of years, especially because of the new shelter, which was a very exciting thing for Response. So tell us, how is Response's shelter different from traditional shelters, and why did you decide to proceed with that model?
Sure, yeah. So just a little history, as I mentioned, we have this housing program. It started in 2019. We started off just using apartments that we rented. And the reason that we started there, well, one, it's the expense of opening a shelter. Two, we wanted to prove that there was a demand here in the valley. And three, at that point in time, really the model that most people knew was a confidential safe house. We live in a valley where you can't pull a building permit without people knowing exactly what you're going to do and where. Everyone knows everyone's business in small towns. And so for me, it felt like we can't build something and keep it confidential. Over that period of time, there has been a really major shift in the movement nationally, where I don't know of any agency that's building a new shelter that is still trying to keep it confidential. It's just unrealistic, even in cities now, because there are tracking devices on people's phones. There are tracking devices put on people's cars. People nowadays who go into shelter are typically, their kids are still going to school. They're still going to work. They're not just staying there until the legal system finishes its process. So there are multiple ways that someone could be followed back to a confidential location. Instead, the move is towards public facing shelters. So we are then able to say to the community, here's where our shelter is. We built a building that is extremely safe, is designed with security concerns as a topmost concern. Our neighbors know what's here. The local police conclude this in their rounds every day. It also destigmatizes folks that have to take advantage of our services. Whereas before in a confidential safe house, you couldn't even tell anybody where you were. Well, we can't have people having visitors at the shelter because of the confidentiality of other people in there. Kids don't have to lie to their friends about where they're going to after school. People don't have to feel ashamed because they're hiding where they're going. We've built a beautiful trauma-informed space for folks to come to, and we think it's the safest model. Statistics have also shown that if an abuser is trying to access their former partner, they're most likely to do it in a place where they know the security or lack of security, whether it's the person's place of work, the kid's school, the grocery store, a facility like this where they don't know, where the security cameras are. We have keypad accesses to our doors. We have panic buttons throughout the building. It makes it a very safe yet welcoming at the same time space.
And Response's office there now too, right?
Yeah, which makes it really convenient because we're able to check in on our residents in the shelter really easily. It's easy for them to come get services from their advocate. We also have a food and clothing pantry right in our office that's for both residents of the shelter and for clients that are still living in community. So we have a lot more resources now. And I think we're already seeing an uptick in clients because it's just obvious where you go if you need services.
Yeah, that's interesting. But it does make sense to me. So, pivoting, but connected to your comment about resources, there's been a lot of talk about funding issues for organizations that provide services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and instability around funding in recent years. Can you share why that's happening and maybe talk about ways that Response has found to maneuver around that and how listeners can support Response or organizations in their local communities that are similar to Response?
Yeah, well, most dramatically, of course, was what happened in late January when the Trump administration, the OMB, issued the directive to freeze federal funding to nonprofits, local and state governments, and tribal entities. At that point, I looked at our budget and realized that we had about $300,000 out of our $1 million budget that could have gone away overnight. And those were funds that were already allocated. We'd already applied for them. They had been awarded. They were either direct federal funds or federal funds that we got through a state pass-through entity. In 2025, because of our new shelter, we had a much larger percentage of our budget that was coming from government sources because there are a lot of great government programs for homelessness prevention and shelter type resources. So that would have been a very scary thing. And we were very fortunate that they walked that back, that there was lawsuits that froze that, and then it was walked back further. But I would say that we don't feel super secure about those dollars still for the rest of the year and for those same grant programs going forward in subsequent years. Now, taking a step back to 2 years previous, domestic violence agencies across the country get a lot of their money from something called the Violence Against Women Act, and specifically a funding stream called Victims of Crime Act. Money is set aside from white collar crimes and put into a fund, and then it's distributed to the states, and the states then distribute that out to agencies in their jurisdiction. That fund had been pretty severely depleted during the first Trump administration. Those funds have a lag time in when they're distributed. So we see the impact of funds that were collected 6 years ago now. So we had already been warned of and then actually seen what was threatened to be a 40% cut in those funds for this year. Colorado was really fortunate in that Colorado, the state, backfilled some of that
Mm.
loss so that we saw a 27% increase. So we were already looking at a drop in funding from those pretty crucial sources. And I would say that our funding here at Response is pretty well diversified compared to some other agencies in less affluent areas. But as I said, in this year with a much bigger budget running a shelter, like we had our numbers go way up. And so we're having a really big focus this year and going forward and really bringing individual contributions, private foundation contributions as a higher percentage of our budget.
Got it. Got it. And so when you said that some organizations aren't as diversified, do you mean they rely more on these state and federal grants as opposed to individual contributions and other sources of income?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think that survivors need the most that gets overlooked by, and you can take that where you want. It could be by communities, by the legal system, well-meaning people.
Right. I mean, there's so many ways. So on the resource side, we have found since COVID, the demand for the counseling services that we provide. We use a contract therapist here at Response. We don't have someone with full-time staff, but we offer survivors at up to 5 sessions with a trauma-informed bilingual counselor. The demand for that has gone up and stayed up. Legal assistance, help with protection orders and custody and divorce is huge. We're also seeing demand for immigration. Oftentimes, one of the forms of abuse is to threaten to turn your partner into ICE if they don't put up with the abuse. And so we have avenues for people who are domestic abuse victims in this country to get visas, and helping people with that process. We need money for that. We actually need more trained attorneys to help with that. So that's another area. In our area, housing is really a difficult issue for everyone. The housing cost here so far outpace the earning power of local people that just people with two incomes have a struggle to find housing. And so survivors that have left their home and are looking for a new place really are struggling to find. In our rental assistance program, where we can help people for up to a year, we're having to increase the amount that we're giving out to survivors every year. So the budget keeps growing. I would say on the cultural, societal level, just that acceptance that this is something that's real,
Mhm.
gender-based violence, and it can affect anyone. And that's a way that folks around you can feel comfortable going out and asking for help if they feel like their friends are supporting them, that and recognizing that that is something that happens.
Thank you, Shannon, for a wealth of information. And I'm so happy that Response exists and is supporting the community and, doing both the preventative work and providing direct services to victims. And you are an incredible leader. I know this just from having seen some of what you've done. For listeners who are interested in supporting Response, how can they do that? And where can they get more information about Response if maybe they know someone who needs Response's help?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for being a wonderful board member as well,
Of
Allison.
course.
So our website is responsehelps.org. And there we have a wealth of resources both on our services, on our new center, but also on what is domestic abuse, what is sexual violence, and that is in English and in Spanish. And then we have a 24-hour crisis helpline if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, which is 970-925-SAFE or 7233. And those are the primary ways to reach us.
Incredible. Thank you so much for being here, Shannon. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone,
Thanks so
for
much for
listening.
having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining us on Rights and Remedies. I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights into the legal issues facing victims and the pathways to healing. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Whether you're a survivor, an advocate, or someone looking to learn more, we're here to support and empower you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. You can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at ALM Law LLC for updates, resources, and more. Until next time, take care and remember that together we can make a difference.